however, follows the parable of the persistent widow. She had come to the judge to ask for relief, for whatever the case may be, and he was denying her time after time after time. But she kept coming. So much so that at the point in time the judge said, let me honor this lady's request so she can stop bothering me. But then Jesus comes with this next parable. The two characters of the parable are praying. But in looking a little deeper, we are made to see what makes us acceptable in the sight of God. These two prayers embody two contrasting views of how to approach God. One on the basis of supposed good works, and the other on the basis of God's grace. There was a very lost, wicked, and rebellious man who decided that it was good for his business if he joined the church. He went to the church, and he stood before the church and indicated the fact that I'm an adulterer, I'm an alcoholic. He had never been a member of the church, but when he got there, he indicated the fact in his public testimony that he had no sin in his life, that he was growing up in the church, and as a result, he was readily accepted into the church. When he went home, he told his wife what he had done. And his wife, being a very godly lady, she exploded. She condemned him for selling that information to the church. Why did you say that? You know good and well who you are and what you want. You know it. Now you need to go right back to that church and tell the truth. So the next week, heeding his wife's desire, he walked down to the front again. And this time, he confessed to the church all of his sins. He told them that he was dishonest. He told them that he had been an alcoholic. He told them that he was an adulterer. And that he was very, very sorry. They revoked his membership on the spot. He walked out of the church that day scratching his head. And he muttered to himself, these church folks are really strange. I tell them a lie, and they take me in. I tell them the truth, and they put me out. How can this be? The Lord Jesus tells the story of two men in a similar situation who had totally different results. One man tried to talk himself into God's kingdom, but he didn't make it. One man tried to talk himself out of God's kingdom, and he made it. Let's look at this verse again to see to whom Jesus told this parable. In Luke 18, verse 9, he says, and he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. Now he's speaking to certain. Now bear in mind, many times when Jesus told parables, there was a reason for it. The reason for him telling parables was the fact that sometimes he wanted to tell somebody something, not get them all upset with him that they would listen to him any further, but they needed to hear what he had to say. And we're sure that some of these certain that were there were Pharisees, because again, what did it say there? They trusted that they themselves were righteous and despised others. Again, the Pharisees emphasized the letter of the law while ignoring the spirit of the law. And their standard of righteousness was based on the laws of Moses and the rabbinical traditions. Now, if you want to know whether or not you are being addressed in this parable, let me ask you a question. Do you ever look at people who don't go to church and think that you are better than they are because you go to church? If you do, you're one of the certain. If you've ever done that, you're one of the certain. Do you ever look down your nose at anyone for any reason, real or imagined, and think that you might be better than they? If you've ever done that, then you're one of the certain. I promise you, every one of us will find ourselves in this story. Because at the one time or another, all of us have been guilty of trying to impress God. Today we're going to find out what kind of prayer impresses God, thereby what makes the perfect prayer. Remember, one, you impress God when you don't try to. You impress God when you don't try to. In verses 10 through 12, we read this. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. The one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. Notice that, with himself. God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Immediately now, we are ready to jump all over the Pharisee because he was, to say the least, a bit arrogant. Quite frankly, he was a good pathfinder. He dotted every religious T. Crossed every religious T, every dotted I. He went strictly by the book. He had a heart for religion. The problem was, the religion was not in his heart. He was standing in the center of the inner court, right in the heart of the temple. The reason he stood there was because it was there he could be heard and seen. He let everybody know just how wonderful he was. First of all, we read that he fasted twice a week. Now, in the Old Testament, the Jews were only required to fast once a year. The Day of Atonement. Just once a year. But here he fasted 103 times a year, more than what he was required to do. Then we read that he paid tithe on everything that he possessed. Now, the Old Testament only required that you tithe your income. But this man may have gone further than rabbinical tradition teaching required. Woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. You pay tithes of mint, anise, and cumin. In other words, they got down to the nth degree, every detail. Now, there's something wrong with fasting more than once a week. There's nothing wrong with fasting more than once a week. And there's certainly nothing wrong with giving more tithe or a double tithe. Nothing wrong with that. The problem was when, and now is, that man thought his goodness gained him brownie points with God. He thought God accepts a person based on what they do for him. In other words, he thought he could work his way into kingdom. He was religious and proud of it. If we put our trust in anything, church membership, church attendance, baptism, religion, our credentials, or good works, or anything at all other than Jesus Christ to make God hear you, let alone accept you, you're only fooling yourself. As the Pharisees prayed to himself. The Pharisee thought that God would be impressed with all his credentials and all that he was doing. So now we learn the first clue of what impresses God. What impresses God is when you don't try to impress him. I heard of a 5th grader that came home very excited from school one day. She had been voted the prettiest girl in the class. The next day, she was even more excited when she came home from class. They had voted her the most likely to succeed. The next day, she came home and told her mother she had won a third contest, being voted the most popular. But the next day, she came home extremely upset. The mother asked, "What happened? Did you lose this time?" She said, "No, I didn't lose this time. I won the vote again." Her mother asked, "Then what is the vote this time?" She said, "I won the most stuck up." Again, this Pharisee would have won that contest hands down. You see, he had an I problem. 5 times you will find the pronoun I in these 2 verses. He was stoned on the drug of self. He suffered from 2 opinions, 2 problems he had: inflation and deflation. He had an inflated position of who he was, but he also had a deflated view of who God is. He couldn't see the truth because his eyes were too close together. His pride had made him too big for his spiritual britches. C.S. Lewis, the theologian, once said, "A proud man is always looking down on those things and people." He's always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you can't see anything that's above you. This Pharisee had fooled himself about himself. He says, "God, I thank you that I am not like other men." But remember, he was like other men, because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There was a man on trial with charges of burglary. As he was standing there, the judge said, "Sir, you can let me try your case, or you can choose to have your case and go to a jury of your peers." The man thought for a minute. And he asked, "Your Honor, what are peers?" The judge said, "Well, they are people just like you." The defendant thought again. "Forget it. I don't want to be judged by thieves who are trying me." Verse 11 says, he stood and prayed thus with himself. You see, the original Greek manuscript actually says he stood and prayed to himself. When you approach God with pride, you wind up talking to yourself. Someone said, the only person God sends away empty is a person who is full of himself. Prideful prayer is nothing more than an echo in your own ears. Number 2, humility impresses God. The contrast Jesus gives would have been easily recognized by those hearing this parable. A publican, tax collector, was as different from the Pharisee as the president is from a pauper. Tax collectors were the scum of Jewish society. They were the IRS of the Roman government. They charged exorbitant rates. They skimmed extra money off the top. They would steal candy from a baby and take a welfare check from their own mother. They were considered traitors to the nation of Israel. Just look at Zacchaeus, who is mentioned in the next chapter. Chapter 19, verse 2, which says, "And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus,